Okay, so I started in '98, and in the fall of '98, and it was in October. And at first I wasn't sure what I wanted to do on campus, and I knew that I wanted to do the newspaper, but I wasn't sure when I was going to dive in. So I finally just came up to the office, and at that time we were in the old house, which was at on Natural Bridge over there by the music building.
Okay.
And they gave the first story they assigned to me was a little thing. It probably should have just been a news brief about some kids who were throwing rocks from the railroad trestle over Florissant Road, which is now the bike trail. And so I covered that, and I talked to the police, and I think I ended up talking to about quoting five different people in the story, like, police sources, and then also like people who were experts on juvenile sentencing and stuff. It was overkill for the story, but I guess it really impressed the editor, and so I stuck around, and so I was there for that year, '98, '99, and then 2000, 2001 was my last year. That was the year that I was editor, and so in between there, I was like a news reporter the first year. The second year, Joe Harris was the editor, and he hired me as his production manager and web editor. So in that year, I was responsible for the entire look of every aspect of the paper. And he basically gave me free rein and told me to do whatever I wanted. And I think he was hoping that I would change the look of the paper, which I did. And so at that time, through much of the '90s, I guess, the paper used kind of like what you guys have now, an old English style font. And for me at that time, that was kind of still the web wasn't really mature yet, but there was a lot of kind of futuristic stuff in the culture. And for me, it was always there was like this dissonance between the name, the current, and this kind of old-fashioned look, what I thought was an old-fashioned, kind of out-of-date look of the paper at that time. So like when I thought about the current, I thought about, like a river current, like motion, moving into the future, and also just the name current, like runs counter to like something old, or the past. Like we want to talk about what's happening now. So I wanted to update the paper in a way that would just make it look more modern. And so that's when we cooked up the swoosh, which was like a design idea that a lot of like almost every company on the web was using a swoosh or something in their logo, it seemed like. So we made a swoosh, and we made it blue because of the river motif, and we just changed a lot of the look of the paper, and I thought it looked cleaner and better, and I was happy with how it came out. What I didn't expect was how long that look would stick around. I just assumed that, a couple of years after I was gone, that someone else would redo it, because that's pretty much through the Current's history. If you look back at the old papers, you see that they changed the look every few years. But actually, my design, or the major elements of it, seemed to stick around for like 7 or 8 years. So I was really surprised how long it stuck around. But that was one of the big things I was proud of that year. And then the last year was the year I was editor. So there's three really good years working at the Current. When I was in high school, like my senior year, I did the newspaper and also the yearbook. And it was just, I don't know, I've always been interested in reading and writing, and I always assumed I would be a writer of some kind, at least at that time of my life. But I really fell in love with the design part, and so I spent a lot of time it was the same story in high school. I guess in high school and college, I was kind of the sort of guy who wanted to change everything, and I didn't want things to look the same. So even in high school, we changed the look of the paper. And actually, now that I think about it, something in common with high school and college was that I didn't care for school colors. So I went to Hazelwood West, and our school colors were red and black. And the newspaper was printed in spot color, so that was black and white plus one color. And that one color was always red. And that drove me crazy. It's like, why don't we change it from month to month? Because it was like, I think it was like once a month or something. Why don't we have it blue one month and yellow the next month? Why does it have to be red just because that's the school colors? So I prevailed and got them to change it. And it was the same thing at the Current also. The blue was the color I wanted for the paper, because I thought if we're named the Current and it's like a river motif, I don't care what the school color is, I want it to be blue. So anytime we did something with the Current, we would make it blue. We had, like when we made mugs, they were blue mugs, and you know, that kind of thing. And that rubbed some people at the university the wrong way. But that was just the kind of person I was, and I was really pig-headed about it, and nothing was going to stop me. But to come back to your question, yeah, it was just being in high school, I really fell in love with you know, writing stories and sometimes butting heads with people, but trying to talk about things that maybe people weren't talking about and looking for stories that were unusual. And I don't know, it gave me a place where I really felt like I belonged. And so I really, really enjoyed the journalism part of my senior year of high school, but I wasn't committed to, like, I didn't know what my career was going to be at all. And so I was open to trying other stuff. And when I got to college, I was still working a job at a restaurant. And at first I thought maybe I might do like a double major. And I was thinking, well, maybe I might want to be a teacher, maybe something with English. I just didn't really know. And so I didn't join the Current right away. I wanted to try a couple of other things. But as soon as I came to the Current, it was clear this is where I belonged, and I pretty much spent most of my life here for those 3 years. I mean, when I was the editor, I kept a sleeping bag in my office just in case. You know, some nights were really long, and so my mom said, you know, when you work those really long nights, maybe better just to sleep over there rather than drive home tired. But I mean, that was the kind of dedication. You know, maybe I was a little bit more dedicated than other people, but everybody, it seemed like, really cared about the Current, and it was a real family. And so when I came here, I felt like I had found my place, and yeah, that's why I stuck around. Well, redesigning the paper was definitely a big one, but then when I became the editor, there were a number of things that were kind of happening at the same time. So it was the year 2000. We had reached the future, like it was the new millennium, and this building, the Millennium Student Center, was going to open in October. And also it was the year of the Current's 1000th issue. And so just by coincidence, those two things were going to happen roughly at the same time. The 1000th issue was going to come out close to the time that this building was supposed to open. Oh, and the other thing was that we were moving. So because we were going to have a dedicated office here in the Student Center, so they were going to move us out of the old house and into this new space. So all of that stuff required a lot of work on my end and on the part of other people at the Current. There were a lot of details that we were still negotiating right up until the wire, like from summer until October, trying to get them to, like when I became editor, I was immediately dissatisfied with how much space we were getting here, because we were leaving a house, a 2-story house with a basement, and coming into this, what I would consider a small office. And so we tried negotiating ways of getting some extra space. Like we were working on trying to get some space downstairs, and at that time they called it the shell space. We were also looking at trying to get maybe some extra, like a writer's room over here in the student government area. And we made a lot of progress on those things, but I think they kind of fell by the wayside after I was finished. That's one of the problems the Current and any college newspaper always has, is that keeping the momentum going from one year to the next as people change. But we moved in here, and it was a lot of work, getting rid of stuff at the house, and you know, finding what we were going to keep and figuring out where to put it all. And then once we got here, finding things were not quite right. Like originally the editor-in-chief's office had 2 desks, and it was meant for the editor and the managing editor, but right away it was clear that that wasn't going to work, because there were times the managing editor needed to have private meetings with people, or that I needed to have private meetings with people. And so we converted a closet into the managing editor's office. You know, so there were a lot of details like that about moving. And then the 1000th issue was another big thing for us. At that time, the paper was usually about, usually around 12 or 14 pages. But we wanted to do something really big with the 1000th issue. So we ended up putting out, I think it was like 30 pages or 32 pages, which was huge. And none of us were really prepared for the amount of work it was going to be. We basically padded out the issue by taking old stories from the 30 however many years it was of the current, and republishing them along with old photos and even old advertisements, and then combining it also with new stuff. So it was a huge amount of work, like finding what would be good stories to pull. I had made a timeline of events at UMSL, and so we wanted to continue that. So we took their first half of that timeline, and then we had to make a timeline for the 500 issues that had come after that. And then also we did stuff like we compiled a list of all the staffers who had ever worked at the Current. So that required going through every issue of the paper and writing down all the names. And then we had to transcribe the stories, because none of this stuff was online at that time. It was all only available in print or on microfilm. And so we actually, the editor before me, Dave Bauer, his mom, we basically hired her to type in a lot of stories. Wow. So she had the unenviable task of just like the manual entry of a lot of this stuff. So we compiled all this material, and then we actually had to lay out on that weekend, 30 pages worth of stuff, and it was an ordeal. And we were way late. I mean, we never blew a deadline like that one. In those days, our print contract was with Press Journal Printing in Louisiana, Missouri. And they would send a driver up here to UMSL, and I think usually we would leave our pages at the police station, and they would just go in there and pick them up. But in this case, the driver came, and we were not ready. It was usually around midnight that the driver would get here. And it was midnight on Sunday, and we still weren't done. And I don't remember the exact number of hours, but he basically slept in his truck while we kept desperately trying to get the paper out. And so in those days, one of the other big changes that we made during the 2 years that I was in production, as production manager and then later as the editor-in-chief, was we started doing digital output. So before I was editor, we really almost never did digital output. It was, you would design the pages on the computer, but then you would print them out in sections, cut out the stories and the headlines, and then paste them using wax onto these big poster boards that we called flats. And so you would compose a page, and then you would have a box full of those flats, and that's what Press Journal would come here to pick up. So, but in those days, so we were doing digital output, and for the 1000th issue, almost all the paper I think we did digitally. There were some, it might have been completely digital, I can't remember for sure. But we didn't trust the digital enough to just do only digital, so as a backup we were still doing flats for every page. And it was just, we only had one printer. And so we were just, for hours, printing stuff out and cutting it and trying to compose all of it for 30 pages or however many pages it was in that section. It was probably, 4 a.m. or something before we were done. And then ultimately, they had my phone number at Press Journal, and they were always welcome to call me if there were problems. And particularly for this issue, we had written out some things that we wanted to make sure they did. And so I said, if you have any questions, call me. So I went home really tired, and they did call. There were problems, and I slept right through the calls. So I think there was a section of the paper that was supposed to be digital, and I don't know if there was a font missing or something like that. And they called me to try and get me to help, but I was just worn out, and I did not hear it. It did not wake me up, so they just used our flats. But It was a behemoth. That thing was, it was huge. And so the Monday that came out that week, we then invited, on 2 different days, we invited the campus community to come see our office and come. And so we had donuts. Get donuts and coffee with your paper was one thing we did for breakfast, and we gave away free donuts, free coffee, and newspapers. And then the other one we did was like free pizza, and that was on a different day, like for lunch. And so we were, and those were like the 2 first real events that were held in this building. So that was the first time that I think like large numbers of students were coming and checking out the building. And so, and then the kind of the crown of all of this was we had a reception. And so we tried to invite all the staffers who had ever worked at the paper to come. And we had the VIPs that we had to invite, the chancellor and those kind of folks. And that was also a lot of fun, getting in touch with all of the people who had worked at the Current over the years. And so yeah, putting together that reception was also another big challenge. So all those things, they all just kind of converged, but that was our big achievement. I think for me as editor, probably I think the biggest challenge is just the unique nature of UMSL and the Current. The Current is a weekly paper. It's not run by professionals, and there's not a journalism program at UMSL. So that is the beauty and the bane of the Current. Like, the beauty of it is that if people with the right personalities who are kind of do-it-yourself kind of people, if those students are here, then they flourish and the paper flourishes. And that was the case for us. But it's sometimes hard to find students like that for all the positions. So we always had trouble like keeping a distribution manager. And so often it would be me running around the campus, delivering the paper and pulling out the old papers and putting in the new ones and stuff. Or even finding good news writers or a news editor. We never had success really keeping a news editor during my year at the Current. So at times my managing editor would serve as the news editor, and then at times I would serve as the news editor. But it was things like that. Or also, we had a lot of diversity the year that I was on staff. We had people from all different backgrounds and countries and stuff, and it was a really great staff. But one of our staff members, during the winter break, she had gone home to Oman, and she got stuck there and was not able to come back right away. And she was our business manager, and so we needed revenue, and since she wasn't here, there was nobody to collect the revenue. And also, in spring is when we needed to make our subsidy request to SABC, and that was her job to do, but she wasn't here. So it became my job. And so that was another part of like the beauty of the Current and the bane of the Current. Like for me, I got to do everything there was to do, which was great experience. But the reason I got to do everything was because there were times when there wasn't anyone else to do it. And so I had to fill in the gap. So I learned how to make a budget, and I learned how to put together a budget presentation. And I also learned how to collect on advertising revenue. And so yeah, there was it was just a really great learning process for me. But it was also hard. I mean, it was hard recruiting and keeping people. And there were all kinds of, just this sort of management things, dealing with conflicts at the paper, also dealing with the university, because our relationship with the university is weird. The Current relies on, or at that time relied on student government for funding, but it also had to cover student government in the news. And so my position was quite strange, having to ask for money and present a request for why we deserved money, but also at the same time covering those budget meetings and covering student government itself. And the same relationship with the university. I had things that I wanted to accomplish in this new office and goals for changes or whatever here. So I'd have to be negotiating, talking with different people in the campus community, but those were the same people that we were writing stories about. And so it's a really kind of a weird situation that the Current has been in. It is independent in some sense, and yet it's also dependent on the university. And so there are tensions in there that can be at times difficult to negotiate. But overall, I mean, the year was really, it was really rewarding, my year as editor. I think the other big challenge might have been during Joe's year, we had a huge story that blew up and became like a national story, which was the newly elected SGA president, Darwin Butler. We learned later had been a convicted felon at the time that he was running for president, or that he had just pleaded guilty to credit card fraud, and that's a felony. And so he was actually, once it was time for him to become president, like he was in jail. And this was just like it was a huge story. And so I was not the news editor, I was the production manager, but I know for Joe and for the reporters and editors at the paper, there were a lot of challenges of how, first of all, how we present this, how do we be fair about the story, and how do we cover this going forward. And so into my year, SGA kind of became a farce. There was, I mean, they were trying to figure out, what do we do with Darwin Butler? Is he immediately disqualified? I think the university basically disbanded SGA, if I remember correctly, and they basically handpicked some students to serve as an interim SGA while they reconstituted SGA the next year. And there was just all this controversy that carried into my year, and so we were covering that. And then there were also some really kind of memorable and strange but endearing characters on all sides of that. So yeah, it was a really interesting time to be at the paper with the things that were happening on campus and stuff. So probably the big issue news-wise was the SGA controversy. You know, a lot of students were upset that the university was infringing on student freedom. You know, the students had elected this guy. What right did the university have to just like say, no, you can't be the SGA, and then redo it? There were also changes happening in university governance. I think, if I remember correctly, we had a faculty senate and a university assembly, and they changed it so it became a university assembly, or a university senate, or I don't remember. They changed those governance structures, and to the students, it was taken as like a power grab by the faculty. That's the way it was interpreted. It seemed like the faculty body was the body that had power to do everything, and then the broader university body, which included students, like had no power to do anything. For us here at the paper, the fallout of that was that the committee which governed the paper became, instead of being a student publications committee, it became, I believe it was like a student affairs / student publications committee. And it was very strange because this committee, which was, it goes back to what I was saying before, that the Current is in a really weird position. It's the redheaded stepchild of the campus, and it doesn't cleanly fit in anywhere. And so by combining these two committees, you had people like the vice chancellor for student affairs and the student government president and the editor of the paper on a committee overseeing the paper. But those people were the same people that we're reporting on. So like if we did stories that made the student government president unhappy in the future, would that affect how he would vote in that committee to oversee us? And so we saw that as a big conflict of interest. And so that was one of the things we did that year, was to rework the bylaws and have them change the bylaws to split that committee up so that there would be a student publications or student media committee that would be dedicated to the Current, and it wouldn't be tied up with other things where there might be conflicts of interest. So that was something happening on campus. And then, there was the usual stuff of are they spending too much money on Mirth Day, different kind of budgetary things. And also that they had just finished this new building, the Millennium Student Center, and they were just in the beginning phases of building the parking garages. And at the time that I was here at UMSL, all the parking structures were essentially temporary structures that had been built in the 70s that lasted like 20, 30 years. And so they wanted to build these new parking garages, but they were going to do it by charging an enormous hike in the parking fee or whatever it was called at that time. And so students were really upset. I mean, it was a huge, like an 800% increase, if I remember correctly. It was graduated, but like over 4 years, I think it worked out to be like a 800% increase. So people were really angry about that, and we covered that as well. And we asked questions, like I remember asking the chancellor, if you knew that, I mean, we've known for decades that we need to replace these garages, why didn't we earlier institute a parking increase sooner so that we could build up the money needed to replace those structures over time? And I think her position was, well, this is a user fee, and so the money needs to be paid by the people who are using the garages. But students felt like that it wasn't strictly speaking a user fee, because who else would be using the garages? I mean, faculty would use them. Patrons of the Performing Arts Center were going to use those garages, and they weren't going to pay anything. So that was kind of a controversy at the time, was the financing of these parking garages. And then also now that I think about it, the Two Hill, or as I like to call it, the Blanche. The Blanche was a big controversy. Faculty seemed to be overwhelmingly against it. They felt that it was a waste of a misuse of money. They wondered about who would pay for the maintenance of it over time. Would it make money and be able to support itself? This was at a time, kind of like now, when there were a lot of budget pressures, and people felt like UMSL was in the midst of a big building boom, and they felt like the Performing Arts Center was unnecessary. We didn't really have much of a fine arts program at that time. And it was just like I think a lot of the faculty, they just did not see the vision for it. And so they saw it as a boondoggle. And so we covered that. And another aspect of that controversy was the airport. Because UMSL is so closely situated to the airport, they wondered, will airplanes go right over campus? Will that noise drown out the performances in the Performing Arts Center? So there were a lot of controversies about the building boom that was happening on campus at that time.
Cool.
So my year as editor put me in touch with a lot of former staffers, because we were planning this big banquet, and we were getting in touch with people who had worked at the Current and inviting them to come. And one of the most famous alums of the Current at that time was Marty Hendon, who was an important executive with the St. Louis Cardinals. And one of the other former Current staffers who had worked with Marty mentioned to me, they have this internship at the Cardinals, and I think you would be perfect for it. And so as I was thinking about what do I want to do in the future, I knew I needed to do an internship or something like that. I wasn't sure where I wanted to go or anything. I honestly hadn't given it much thought, because all my energy had been on the Current, and I just wasn't really thinking or planning for the future, which in retrospect was unwise. But when I heard about the internship and the kind of the Current connections that were there, I thought, oh yeah, great, this is a sure thing. I'll apply for that, and I'll go work for the Cardinals, and it'll be great. I love baseball. I love the Cardinals, and so I put together my application for that, and I kind of sent it in, and I didn't really think about it a whole lot, and I certainly didn't prepare for it. And so when the time came to go have the interview and all that stuff, it didn't go very well, and I did not get the internship. And so that left me at a loss, because for, I don't know, a couple of months, I had been kind of counting on that as a sure thing, and I'll definitely get that internship. And so once that was gone, I was like, oh man, what am I going to do now? And that's when it occurred to me, maybe you should be applying for internships at actual newspapers. And I don't know why that thought didn't occur to me sooner, but it didn't. And so I desperately, at that late part of the academic year, we were getting very close to the end of the year, I started desperately sending out letters and phone calls and applications to the Post-Dispatch, Riverfront Times, and different papers, the journals. And to my great fortune, the Post did need an intern, a design intern. And so they said, yes, we are actually looking for a design intern, even though it was unusually late in the semester to be trying to get one. And they brought me in, and they liked the work I had done at the paper, the redesign, and some of the pages that we had done. And so they brought me in as an intern. And that year was the year that the St. Louis Rams, God bless them, they went to their second Super Bowl that year. And so I was still a student and still going to classes and stuff, but then I was working essentially full time at the Post, designing sports pages or whatever they needed me to do. And as we got to December, my internship was supposed to finish, but they said, the Rams are looking surprisingly good, and it looks like they're on course for the Super Bowl. Would you stay on, because we're going to be doing a ton of special sections and special coverage, and we're really going to need the help. And I was like, sure. So I think it was like a 3 or 4 month internship. They doubled it basically. And I stayed on to help them with that Super Bowl coverage and then the stuff that came after. And so that was a really great experience, and then it was finished, and I still had maybe another half a year or a year to go at UMSL, and I worked on campus at Public Policy Research Center, but I knew I wanted to be in journalism, and so every so often I would get opportunities to go back to the Post. They would bring me back as a temp to fill in when people were sick or on maternity leave. And after a few of those, they finally hired me on, and I've been there ever since. And kind of along the way, I also did like some web design and some freelance design for other places. But everything that I do in my career now, I owe it all to the Current. And I was really uncertain about where things were going, but the Current kind of crystallized for me, this is the industry that you have a chance to make a difference in. This is what you're good at. I thought I would be a writer, and that is not really what has happened. I've been a designer, and now I'm a coder. I also do a lot of programming and stuff at the Post. But it's just, I've had a really rewarding career, and I owe all of it to those experiences that I had at the Current. That's where I learned how to do what I'm doing now. Oh yeah, I come back on campus usually about once or sometimes twice a year. Mike Murray sometimes has me in his classes, and I always make a pitch for the Current every time I'm here. I really believe strongly in the Current as an independent student voice, and I feel like at times the paper has gotten really short shrift here at the university, again, because it is sort of a red-headed stepchild. There's not a journalism program that can kind of take the Current under its wing. And that's been both a good and a bad thing. I think in recent years it's been really tough for the Current. But no matter what, I believe in the people who come here, and I believe that this organization has the power to really change students' lives if they'll invest in it. And so, yeah, like when the right people are here, giving their all, I mean, it is transformative. It is that. Yeah, well, I guess I could. Okay, so I guess I talked a lot about like the coverage the newspaper would do, but didn't really talk a whole lot about like the social part of it. The Current was a true like student organization in the sense that, yes, it was kind of business-like. We had something we needed to do, we had a product we needed to put out, and there was business to take care of, but it was also a life. We would get together during the years I was there. We had like a weekly bowling night. We were always going out bowling. We would go to Denny's or Steak and Shake. We were always doing stuff together, and so like having game nights and stuff at people's houses, going on these trips, where people would party or whatever, and it was just there was a real social bond for people who were at the Current, and I really loved being here. And yes, I had, sometimes we had our problems, our disagreements, but by and large, I mean, I just really loved working with all the people who were here, and that social part of it was really like a strong glue for the organization. And I know at other times in the Current's history, the Current has a colorful history. There's been a lot of you know, a lot of crazy stuff that's happened over the years. But that history also is, I mean, it's just fun to have been part of that. And the storytelling that sometimes happened. During the years that I was at the Current, we had people who had been at the Current a long time. Several of the staffers were like really long timers. And some of the people who started around the time that I did are, in fact, still around today. So there is a little bit of that continuity, those strings of continuity. And so we felt kind of tied into that history, even though really we were only there for a short time, just a couple of years. We still felt tied in with that history of the paper. So yeah, the history of it and the you know, just the social parts of it they really impacted me.